My name is Julia. I'm the education coordinator here at Big Sky Film Institute. And this film club is part of our Native Filmmaker Initiative, a program that we run year-round. And the film club in particular is something I work with Mike Jetty and Inspired Classroom here in partnership with Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences and Vision Maker Media to bring Native and Indigenous focused films into classrooms across the state of Montana. And today we have classrooms like Marin Elementary, Drummond, Arlee, Ronan, Cook City, Sealy, which, in case Stevie's not familiar, these are schools from across the state that are virtually welcoming us into their classrooms today. Wow, so just a quick housekeeping note. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Everybody, we've been through this before, but if your class isn't speaking, please remember to keep your microphone off. And if you're having any tech problems, type in the live chat so Allie can know and she can let me know. So the voice that you hear onto the side is Allie Dupuy, and she is the co-founder of Inspired Classroom, who will be joining us today. So we're going to be tag teaming and answering your questions as you have them as we move along. So we're going to touch on some subjects and some things in the film, and you guys get to ask those hard-hitting questions. And Stevie has generously donated his time, probably a little jet-lagged, to join us today.
A lot of jet lag.
Where did he come back from? So as I just mentioned, Stevie just got in from Tokyo, Japan, and he is the executive producer of the film Rumble, which some classes here today have already seen. And for those of you that haven't, we'll be going through an overview of the film, and we'll be talking about a few specific clips as we go along. So don't worry if you haven't seen it. We will give you the context to be able to talk about it. So with all that said, we chose this film in particular because it talks a lot about Native American role in popular music history, specifically rock and roll history. And so with that, because we're a film institute, we'll be tying that into the significance of that within the history of documentary filmmaking. So without further ado, I just want to introduce Stevie Salas, executive producer and also rock musician. Stevie, do you want to say hello to everybody?
Yes, how cool. This is really, really cool. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining. And also joining with us is Indian Education Specialist Mike Jetty from the Office of Public Instruction here in Montana. Mike, do you want to say a hello to everybody in a quick introduction?
Sure. Mohammed Takiapi, Yuha Chante Waste Napechuza Pado. Hello, my relatives, and I greet all of you with a heartfelt handshake, and so glad to be here today. So thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you, Mike. So just a quick thing before we get started in here. One thing I really want to underscore as we dive into talking about this discussion is some really important terms that we're going to be talking about today as we talk about cultural expression. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with these terms, but these are really going to help put some context into us talking about this musical history and Native American role and influence within this history. So I'm going to run through these, and I'm going to ask two classrooms to give me examples of what one of these definitions mean. So I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but Allie's going to help me get some brave souls up here to give me some examples. So just to start off, we're going to be talking about identity, culture, community, and ideology. Some basic terms here. And I'm sure many of you are familiar, but identity are the qualities and beliefs of an individual. So examples of this are your age, gender, what your first language is, what your role in the family might be, and things like that. Culture is shared beliefs, traditions, practices of a group. So this is you have a cultural background of something. Maybe you have a family tradition that you celebrate once a year. Some people it's like Thanksgiving or Christmas holidays or things like that. But they're very different based on different cultures and different cultural groups. Community is a feeling or wanting to be with other people, of coming about other people in a group. So this is something that we can create ourselves as we're forming that sense of what our ideology and our identity, who do we identify with. Community can be outside of our family, and it's people that make us feel our best selves. Lastly, ideology is one's understanding of how the social world works. This is something that we all kind of create over time, and it's also something that is rooted in our values and our beliefs. So this is just kind of a bedrock of things that we're going to be talking about with the film Rumble today. So before we dive into the actual film, I'm wondering if maybe two schools, one from each school, can give me one example of a quality of identity that they see in themselves.
Wonder, let's go to Mr. Tugas's class first, and then after we go to Mr. Tugas's class, we're going to go to Mrs. Belisa's class. So go ahead,
Great.
Mr. Tugas, and unmute your microphone.
There we go. What do you guys think? Okay, so your beliefs about a certain subject? Okay. Anybody else have anything?
So Mr. Tugas, can you repeat
that?
Sure. So say it again, Naraya.
This is an example of identity.
Right. So like qualities, meaning like something that you believe in or things that you do that make you you, I guess. It's like
Yeah.
Sway from, like you are that opinion of yourself. Or
Exactly. So an example of identity would be, for example, that, my name is Julia, I'm 25 years old, I identify as female, and English is my first language. Whereas ideology is, I believe everyone should be treated equally, and community groups are important, and things like that. So identity is a little bit more focused on things you don't have so much control over, and ideology is something that you form over time.
Wonderful. Let's go ahead to Mrs. Belisa's class. And if any of the other classes would like to write those answers, their thoughts in the chat box, we can come back to those in a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and I'm wondering if Sealy Lake would like to type in, and maybe we could have Mrs. Mayo's class answer live.
So I see some hands there. Why don't we keep this, keep this in the back of our heads as we move forward. You guys kind of hold on to those thoughts and we can circle back around. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. This is just kind of a frame of reference for things that we're going to be talking about today. So as we kind of go into things, I'm going to go back to my main framework and settle back in. So this film really addresses this overarching influence of Native American musicians that paved the way within the music industry. And more importantly, it pinpoints the roots of a lot of rhythms and sounds within rock and roll and contemporary music. So Stevie, to kind of start things off, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the film's title, Rumble. Seeing as most of our audience is a little younger, they might not be familiar with this guitar riff. Do you mind giving us a little context to the film? And then afterwards, we can watch a quick clip of a scene from the film where we can hear that riff.
Yeah, a rumble. Well, there's a couple of reasons that we called it Rumble. Originally, I worked with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian with a guy called Tim Johnson, who's also a producer on the film Rumble. But before we made the film, we created the exhibit at the Smithsonian where we fleshed out all the information. And for the Smithsonian, Rumble was a little too wild. The Link Ray song, the song Rumble is a song from the 50s that is sort of the birth of rock and roll. It's the birth of distorted guitar. It's a song that influenced most rock and roll people that we all know, even though most people don't know Link Ray. All the most famous musicians in the world know Link. But for the Smithsonian, we called the exhibit Up Where We Belong, Natives and Popular Culture. And it was a little bit more of a Smithsonian-friendly type of name. But for the movie, we wanted to call it Rumble, and I wanted to call the exhibit Rumble, actually. It's Smithsonian, but I was outvoted. And the thing about Rumble is Rumble is the film. We used music as the way to draw people in to tell a familiar story of a bit of history that, like a lot of Native American history, is erased or was forgotten or was hidden or was buried. Most most people, like my grandparents, wouldn't want to even, anyone didn't even know they were Native. They were just so conditioned to be like, hey, keep your head down, be invisible, just get through this. And we used music as a way to tell a story that actually connects through a lot of different things. The music was a way to get people to come and watch. And if you really get down to the deeper part of the story, you didn't have to use music to tell a lot of what was really going on. But we wanted to tell a story of how these people influenced the most famous people in the world, and how they were heroes. These musicians in Rumble were heroes to the most famous artists that we know today, and we wanted to show that. And Rumble, the Link Ray song, was the birth of rock and roll. It's where rock and roll. Most people consider the song Rumble is the birth of rock and roll. 1957, one of the births, I would say.
Yeah. Well, and with that context, I'm going to show a quick clip for those of you that weren't able to see the film, so we can listen to that riff and then open it up for questions for students, just because I think that when you hear it, you really get a better sense of why this was so groundbreaking.
Yep. Is this the second clip?
Yes. So it's, yeah.
One right here. Alrighty. Perfect. There you go.
I was doing this hop at this record hop in Fredericksburg, Virginia, 1957.
The kids were gathered around in this arena, and they were yelling for the stroll. Link says, I don't know a stroll.
I said, I don't know a stroll. Doug said, I know the beat behind one. And you think, I said, okay. Like this, and then my guard, man, watching me, he said, bam, I went.
Middle of the night and the radio's on. That makes you levitate out of bed about 4 feet. What is he doing? There's no sound like that. Nowhere on the air.
It changed everything. Rumble made an indelible mark on the whole evolution of where rock and roll was going to go. And then I found out that he was an Indian.
That was the rawest form of the kind of guitar that a lot of the guys that I listened to, is where it started, and it even still sounds better when he does it.
Kind of punt questions over to Mike about wrapping this into essential understandings. We're going to take questions from 2 classrooms. Is there any classrooms that want to share or have a question for Stevie so far about, for example, for me, I'm curious when he says you find out that he's Indian, and that changes this, that kind of changes things as far as this understanding. Arlie, do you want to ask a question, or do you have any insights? Yeah, I see some hands. Is that Mr. Teskey's class?
All right, yeah, we've got a student that wants to ask a question. They're being kind of shy. They've got lots of questions to ask, but they're hesitant to do it. So we've got a student in Garrett.
Why did you find this piece of information interesting?
The question was, why did you find this piece of information interesting? I realize that's a kind of a big question, but Stevie, do you want to talk a little bit about You talked a little bit about how you got started in this, but this specific riff, do you want to expand a little bit more on that?
Well, why it was interesting. Okay, why does Robbie Robertson, who's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, who is Mohawk, say in the filming? Then we found out. First, they hear this crazy music on the radio, and then it gets banned from the radio. At this, you got to imagine in the 50s. I mean, it was just like, crazy, happy days, And they hear this aggressive piece of music. Here's a native guy who's hearing it, and then all of a sudden he finds out that guy is also a native. To him, it was crazy because natives never got any recognition for anything back then. So it was shocking to them that this guy was actually like one of us. No way. That's why it was shocking to a lot of people. But it's also why it was kept hidden. In the film, you'll see Link's daughter talks about how the family used to have to hide the fact that they were Native American. They didn't tell anybody. Robbie Robertson himself said one time, his mother told him, proud of who you are, but be careful who you tell. Because that was a sign of the times. Nowadays, you can be proud and you can say it. And that's why it was so interesting to a lot of people when they found out that Link Ray was a Native American.
Great, thank you. I saw a bunch of hands up in, do you know that classroom down there?
Which one are you looking at?
On the far, second from the right.
The second from the right. Oh, and I believe that's Morin Elementary.
Morin Elementary? We'll take a question from you. I saw some hands up.
So, what inspired the movie?
What inspired?
Yeah, go ahead.
I can just tell you really quick. Originally, what happened was, and I'll try to make it quick so I don't put everyone to sleep, but I was playing rock and roll my whole life as a kid. I started to play when I got out of high school. I got this incredible job playing guitar for a guy called Rod Stewart. Most of you probably don't know, but at the time when I was a kid, he was a superstar. And I went right from my high school band to this gigantic thing. And I was playing Madison Square Gardens, which is this really famous place in New York City. And I thought to myself, as I was at sound check that day, it was like, am I the only Native American guitar player to ever play Madison Square Gardens? I asked myself this. And as I started to look into this, I started to realize that not only was I wasn't the only Native American guitar player. There were some people that were before me that were, I considered incredibly famous, but nobody knew were Native. I didn't even know they were Native. So as a hobby, I started to go just to study, just to look, because my life in music was I wanted to know who else was kind of like me. And in 2004, I was in Canada. I was opening for a band called the Rolling Stones. And I met a guy called Brian Wright McLeod, who was writing a book called the Encyclopedia of Native American Recorded Music. And it documented all the music ever made by Native American people on a major, on a global scale, going all the way back to 1908 and wax cylinders. So I started to think I think this information needs to be known because I felt like a lot of people in Indian country didn't know they had role models. Maybe their role models were all people from 150 years ago. And I thought, well, they should know about Buffy St. Marie and Robbie Robertson and Link Ray and Jesse Ed Davis. And so I just set out to get the information out. So it was supposed to be a small thing so Native people could see they had some incredible people that not only excelled in the mainstream world, it proved that if they could do it, anybody could do it and anything could be done because these people did it and they did it in times that were a lot tougher than today. And that's all it was. That was my inspiration, just to get the information out so people would have someone to be inspired, to inspire some people. And then it turned into, we completely, unearthed unwritten history and changed history as we know it. And now this history is being taught in schools as part of American history. So it became a much bigger thing than we originally set out to do. That was the inspiration.
Definitely. Well, and I think that what you mentioned, that this becomes more of a conversation in history classes now. Mike, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how this deep spiritual connection of many Native and Indigenous members that feel through music, how this kind of ties into Montana's own essential understandings, which is a required in our Constitution to talk about this history and Native and Indigenous influence in this country and also the state of Montana. Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about EU3 and some examples maybe of some Montana musicians?
Sure. You know, when I first saw this movie here, I was blown away. And I said, I want, you know, every kid in Montana to have a chance to view this film and to, you know, see those amazing individuals who are groundbreaking in the genre of rock and roll. And so, like Indian Education for All, you know, we tell these stories that may not be so well known regarding history and culture and perspective of Native peoples. And this is a great contemporary story, not just talking about the past. And so I thought I'd throw up a few slides, if that's okay.
Please do.
Let's see if I can do this. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Cool. And so, you know, here's the title of the movie, and I really like how you put this, The Indians Who Rocked the World. And it's powerful, but it ties into our essential understandings, definitely, as we think about, you know, individual diversity, looking at these amazing, you know, artists, history from Native perspectives. And I think the more Native filmmakers that we have that can share these stories that are, you know, untold stories in our country's history that I think everybody needs to hear about, that's powerful. And one of our curriculum resources we have is called More Than Flutes and Drums. Because oftentimes we think about Native American music, we might think powwow, we might think flutes and things like that, but there's this whole other side to that story. You know, we think about rap and reggae and country and rock and roll. And so this curriculum actually gets into that. You know, who are some contemporary artists out there that are, you know, groundbreaking, you know, trailblazers. And so it ties into this essential understanding too, you know, who are Native people today and how does that culture influence their identity, and then essential understanding 3, talking about these old songs, like you mentioned, the old recordings, the real recordings. I actually got to hear some of those when I was at the Smithsonian, these old Lakota songs, and then to hear those and listen to songs that I knew and talking about that cultural continuity. But, you know, you think about how everything's connected. A lot of these songs are still sung, these old ceremony songs, but then how new songs are being created that have cultural roots too. And a good example of that is Superman. You know, he was featured in the film at the end of the movie, dancing there in the scene about Standing Rock. But, you know, this guy's a rapper, he's a powwow dancer, he's a singer, a flute player, and, you know, a contemporary role model. And so I think, you know, he's an amazing individual, and I want everybody to know his story too. And so I just thought I'd share that. But, you know, it's really cool to, you know, to see these stories and to have, you know, a Native filmmaker tell these stories, a Native musician like yourself, Stephen. That's awesome. So very cool.
I just filmed Soup, by the way, for another project we're doing, and we spent a lot of time with him and Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas. So I know Soup really well. Matter of fact, the other day I was on a flight to Los Angeles, and him and his family got on the same plane where they were going to Disneyland. So it was just ironically, I ran into him on an airplane.
That's cool. Very
Small
cool.
world. I'm wondering if we could get a raise of hands of any classrooms or students that have seen Superman or Superman has come into their classroom. Yeah. Does one class want to share that experience and what they learned from his performance and what he said, kind of what performing music means to him as a Montanan and as a Native American? We'll take a question from Kathleen. Do you want to?
Was it Ronan that? Ronan, did you raise your hand?
I see lots of hands in
Yeah, Ronan, do you want to share?
Tugas's class?
All right, so when Superman was in our, like, auditorium, he was explaining how he would make videos and that he was proud of his culture and his people and his music as well. So
Oh, I mean, they had it all written, and everything was.
Yeah, that's a really good point. He talks a lot. I know I've seen him perform and him talking about his cultural roots and a lot of the base of the rhythms there. That's a really good point. Maybe one more class. Do you want to share? I saw some hands over, was it Cook City
no,
or?
it's not Cook City, it's Marin, I think.
Marin, did you want to share? One brave soul.
One brave soul.
It's hard to talk.
Go ahead, Ronnie Joe, you're.
Jiggle.
Yes. Louder.
We went to a show. We went to one of Superman's shows at Alberta Bear, and
A theater in Billings, Montana, or south of Billings, on the Crow Reservation.
He brought me on stage, and it was terrifying.
It is. I'm sure Stevie can speak to how daunting it can be to be on stage. You
I
said
think
you're
that-
on the.
Eh,
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Stevie.
I think this is terrifying. So I understand.
It is very new. And you mentioned that it's on the Crow Nation, which is where Superman is, where he's from and where he identifies
Might
in.
be fun to see how many students are tribal members.
How many students, if you feel comfortable sharing, are tribal members here today? Maybe we'll get a show of hands. Yeah, so when we talk about Indian country and these concepts of how you identify as Native American, I think this is a really comfortable space to be able to share that, and a super important history, because we all have very different cultural backgrounds and ways of, and different sounds and music and the foods that we eat. And I'm wondering, Stevie, if you can talk a little bit as an identifying member of Apache tribe. Can you talk a little bit about where that is and some of the music that you grew up listening to?
Well, I have an odd story, really. I grew up, my father lived in the country between outside of Cheyenne, Wyoming, in kind of in the middle of nowhere. And he left there when he was 17 and joined the Marines to go fight in the Korean War. And when he came back, he settled in near San Diego, California, working in Camp Pendleton. He was a Marine. My mother's family all lived along the border of New Mexico, Arizona, there near Clifton, Arizona. And they migrated to California. And so when I was born on the beach in Oceanside, California, and I spent my life surfing and playing guitar and riding a skateboard. I knew who I was as a human being, we were always told, but was not like, we were just like regular people living in California. Like I said, skateboarding, surfing. I grew up with the kids of every color. So I didn't see color because of the Marine Corps base. There were so many people there from all over the place, all over America, that we didn't see a lot of, I didn't notice any racism. I didn't grow up with any of that stuff. And so therefore I didn't have any of the things that were repressing me or holding me back. And so I needed to go later in life and learn more about my culture. And in the film, we talk about that, how I would go back to Indian country to ground myself and to find balance. And because I didn't have that part of my culture. It came late for me. Same with Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas. He could never understand where he didn't know anything. His real father was not in his life. He had a stepfather who identified as a Mexican American, and he lived in a very Mexican American neighborhood in Los Angeles. But he always had these feelings about how he danced and how he heard music and how he felt about things in his heart. So one summer, he went to live with his grandmother. She told him all about his family history, which all of a sudden things started making sense to who he was in his mind and in his heart. All of a sudden things started to become clear to him. So for me, I spent a lot of time going back, trying to learn about my culture. A lot of the culture in New Mexico was erased. I remember my mother saying they used to make jokes. Oh, we're not Indian, we're Castilian, we're from Spain. And they all laugh because nobody in New Mexico. They were still shooting Apaches in the early 1900s in New Mexico, so they had a lot of trauma. So for me, it's different. I didn't grow up immersed in my culture. I grew up, in some ways, my parents not even wanted to talk about it. And so I came back and learned later. So I was sort of a different example of that.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing that. Speaking of trauma, the film really draws attention to the history of trauma with cultural expression, especially within Native American indigenous communities. And in the film, we talk about the massacre of Wounded Knee from 1890, and how this tragic history is a really pivotal one in understanding power and perceived threat with the musical experience. And so I'd like to show a clip, and as we're watching this clip, which is from the film, for those of you that haven't seen it, I would like students to make some notes as you're watching, to be active listeners and respectful viewers.
Yep. Oh, sorry.
So this is something I do when I watch films.
Sorry about that.
As we watch. It's an exercise. So if everybody has a piece of paper or can get a piece of paper and fold it in half, might take a second, so bear with us. Thanks. How do you make this?
Make it big?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Play at the top.
Oh, great. So this exercise is a notice wonder exercise. So before I pull up the clip, so on your left side of your paper, I want you to write, sorry, I'm dealing with notice. And as you're watching, when I say notice, I mean observations. So as you're watching, look for details or quotes from the film that really stand out to you, because we're going to be talking about this after we watch the clip. Who's being interviewed? Are they funny? Are they upset? Why are we talking about this specific clip? And as you're watching, ask yourself, is this happening right now? Or are we talking about something that's happened in the past? This is really important as we're talking about history and the present, because this all kind of culminates in today. So one example is when I was watching, I saw some old footage, archival footage we call, of a traditional ghost dance. And from this observation, I ask a question. So with this question is my wonder, which is going to be your right side of the paper. What does this observation make you think? Write down these observations, questions, or comments that you have. This is your reaction side. Why did you choose this detail? And what question arose from this detail? If I saw old footage of a ghost dance, which is right behind me, this makes me wonder what was threatening about this musical performance. So this is my own example, but I want you to write down at least one notice, which is a question, and wonder, which is an observation. Or notice, which is an observation, wonder, which is a question. There you go. So with this information, we're going to watch a quick clip, and we'll answer your questions.
Some help? Yeah, I'll take it for you.
Thank you for
technology. It's awesome. Actually, it is. We get to do all sorts of cool stuff. All right, here we go. Oh, was this the right?
Yeah, that's the one. Yes.
Yep. Great. Run.
Music by Native people presented a threat, was seen as dangerous, and people were arrested. Singers and dancers incarcerated for performing this music, treaty-guaranteed rations withheld from them. The federal government begins passing law after law in an effort to control Native people in every way that you can imagine.
They went after every part of our culture. So of course they're going to go after the music, because it's an integral aspect of our culture. Because back in that time, in those times, everybody had a morning song to greet the day. They were songs of ancestor. They were songs of the old way. They went after our culture. It was genocide, and they wanted to erase every cultural perception of reality that we had.
on December 29th, 1890, the U.S. Army surrounded a number of ghost dancers at Wounded Knee and slaughtered over 300, mostly women and children, but also men who were participating in the ghost dance. And this is essentially the beginning of the banning of Native music in the United States.
Okay.
Done with that.
Pull that guy up big.
And
Here, look at it for you.
should be more tech savvy for working at a film
You are
institute.
doing so good. You are a rock. You are a rock star.
So with that, I'd like to open it up to classrooms. Thank you, Allie. For some observations and questions that you might have from that clip, and then we'll direct those questions to Stevie and Mike. So can I get questions from 2 classrooms?
Let's go to Arlie again.
Arlie, do you have any questions? Or share with us an observation that you made?
Yes, we do. Just look right in the camera, right here.
Don't get super close.
Good job.
And remember to speak up, please.
So why would they want to squash like that part of their culture when they have their own version of like singing and dancing? Like why can't they just think logically and be like, oh hey, they're like us but slightly different?
That's a great question. Stevie, do you want to answer that one for us?
Remember, I grew up surfing and playing guitar. I got a D in history class, okay? And then now I sometimes speak at Notre Dame University and stuff, and I tell everybody, I am no history expert. I just got lucky when I made this film, but my whole answer to all of this question was just pure ignorance. I think people were fear is a big problem. People were afraid of what they didn't know, what they couldn't understand. And so I just say ignorance. Ignorance and fear were a major issue I would think.
Well, and we can also kind of expand on that with Mike Jetty, who is a teacher and an educator himself.
He would be much more qualified. I'm sure.
No, is very familiar with that teacher or that history. And Mike, do you want to go in a little bit about into this history and why the words that we use matter?
No, definitely. We think about, cultural hegemony and, who's telling the story. Terms like massacre versus battle. It's like there was, ignorance, but also, America was a very racist society at that time. There was some, white people thought they were, culturally and racially superior to, minority groups. And so there was a certain attitude that folks had. And, like Native folks were seen as a threat. It's like, well, let's just wipe out this cultural group, kill the Indian and save the man was the old mantra from the boarding school era. And so, so you put that in its historical context, Indians, were fighting for their freedom, but then, other folks have labeled them as hostile. And so, who's defining that? And so I think that's why we have programs like Indian Ed for All, to show a more inclusive look at our country's history. And, like with the ghost dance, congressional medals of honor were given to those cavalry members for slaughtering women and children. And there's actually a bill in Congress right now to rescind those medals. And so, this is, the survivors of that massacre, their descendants are actually, fighting to say this was not an honorable thing for anybody to be involved with. And why did they give out these medals of honor, which is the highest honor the military can give, for killing innocent women and children. And so that story is still being told, and it's powerful, but I think, it's part of our country's history, and we need to be aware of that. And but then how do we move beyond blame, shame, and guilt? None of us are responsible for that, but I think it's important for us to learn this, because democracy is a work in progress. There's this myth of American democracy that we started out great and we've been getting better ever since. Well, that's not quite true. But I think the more stories that are told, and films like Rumble do a great job of telling an untold story that I think everybody needs to hear about, and have more positive Native role models and messages out there. So, there's a lot of sad moments in our country's history, but I think, we're at a healing time. We're at a healing moment. We're dealing with historical trauma, but I think going back to our cultural roots, languages, traditions, ceremonies is healing a lot of Native communities and can help everybody, you know, I think. So it's powerful, you know, that notion of identity. It's big. So does that kind of answer or help answer that question?
Yes, definitely. And I'm sure I'd love to see a raise of hands of any students that have been to any local powwows or any tribal kind of productions within their own towns. Yeah. So I see a lot of hands up. I think everybody here, I know Montana is one of the largest Native American populations in the US. I grew up in Alaska, an Alaska Native. We would go to powwows, and it's a very respectful time, but it's a cultural expression, and music is a huge avenue for that, as we have talked about already a lot today. I'm wondering if we could get one more question before we move on from another class. I see a lot of hands up. We will go with Kathleen. Do you know which class it is? Sorry, I keep forgetting.
They need their names on the bottom. How about Mr. Landolfi? Question?
Okay, Mr. Landolfi's class is in with me, and so we do have a question.
Good, great.
Hi. It ain't really a question, it's more like an observation. Is that right if I say it?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, okay. So, this is my observation of the film. When the first settlers came here, they realized that music was the key to our culture and tried to destroy the source. But they failed because we're still here loud and proud. And sometimes I imagine a powwow with no music. There would be no music and no dancing, no drums, and no stick game. It would just be a fair but with no rides.
That was really, really beautiful. Thank you for sharing. What was your name?
Karis Fisher.
Karis Fisher. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yay.
Please be respectful as we're sharing personal things, you guys. That was really lovely. And I was talking about cultural heritage. I'd like to talk a little bit also about, this film really shows this kind of combined history of African American music and Native American music. And I know, since most of us are familiar with artists like Superman, who incorporates hip hop into a lot of the music that he does, I'm wondering if, Stevie, if you can talk a little bit about what you learned making this film about this history, and kind of note something that you, like before and after the making of the film, and how you stumbled across this.
Well, I'll tell you, I started, I was discovered by a guy called George Clinton, who is the king of funk music, really. And all of him and Bootsy Collins and these people that are all in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame now, they're all from mixed descent. And the greatest thing is in the film, when one of the Neville brothers, Cyril Neville, says, you start to realize, you take these people that were cast out, and they start getting together, and you take African polyrhythms with the powwow, 4 on the floor drum beat, and you start to create which is what created blues and what jazz and all of these things came from. Later in life, people started to categorize who did what, and somehow Native American people didn't get any credit for anything. So this film sort of showed where all of those sounds came from, and it started to make sense. You know, we were always told that the Delta blues was an African American art form. I was always told that since birth. And one day, Billy Gibbons from a band called ZZ Top said to me, "Look at this picture of Charlie Patton, and he doesn't, you know, he's got curly, wavy blonde hair and reddish blonde hair." And we're like, "Wow! I mean, we never really thought about that." Turns out that he was a native, and then you start to, and once you hear this, you started to look, and then all of a sudden these things that were invisible became visible. They were there the whole time. We just couldn't see them. We didn't even think that Howlin' Wolf and these famous people who are the icons of the birth of blues, which became rock and roll, were natives. We were just always assumed that they were African American, And that's what the film sort of opened my eyes a lot, because as we dug in, I started to even be like, wow, it's so much deeper than I even imagined. And I found that to be fascinating. So all of a sudden we had a place at the table, the dinner table, of the creation of this incredible meal of popular music, and we had no idea.
Well, and that brings up a really good point too, is, and a lot of what we teach, and Mike talked about this a little bit in our essential understandings, you know, there is no generic Indian. There is, you know, we talk about this melting pot in America. We have, you know, cultures that are interacting with each other, things kind of transfer over. Mike, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about this essential understanding too, and kind of tie in some of these contexts into the context of Montana.
Sure. I guess a good example of this cultural blending would be a group called the Métis, or the Michif. They're the descendants of, you know, French fur trappers and Korean Assiniboine folks. And so what's cool about that unique cultural group is they have still old fiddle traditions from the fur trade era. You know, folks up on the Fort Belknap Reservation still play old fiddle tunes that are 200 years old. And so they might be playing some fiddle tunes, and then the next day they're going to a powwow and singing songs. And so it's a good example of, you know, both and more, you know, blending cultural traditions, and not saying one's better than the other, but how to, you know, incorporate them today and make a unique cultural identity like that. And so that's a really cool story that we have here in Montana. Like my mom, she knew old French drinking songs from the fur trade era, and she grew up here, you know, in a one-room cabin. But yet at the same time, she'd hear all these old, you know, words in Ojibwe language too, and old songs too, but, you know, hear these French tunes. And so I think, you know, a good blending of cultures is what we've seen. But then we also have, you know, like we mentioned Superman, but we've got other, you know, rock and roll musicians here in Montana. Jared Stewart, he's Crow, an amazing guitar player. And he's got a really cool statement about, well, why don't you play Indian music? And he says, well, I don't have to. You know, he's like, it's really cool. He says he can play whatever he wants. And then you got folks like Superman who may rap about native topics, but he may rap about other things besides Indian issues too. And so you don't have to be put in a box, I guess is the thing. It's like there's a wide range of identity out there. And music's one form of expressing your identity. So.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And I actually would like to hear from the students on this one. Are there any musicians with us today that, even if you don't play all the time, even if you dabble in it, can we maybe get a show of hands and a few examples from some of the class of what instrument you play and how long you've been playing?
I think that's Ronan.
Ronan, do you want to start off?
Oh, instrument I play? I play I play trombone and tuba.
Clarinet. Guitar, man.
Oh, we've got a whole mix of musicians. Trombone, tuba. You guys are a whole band in that room. And we'll get a few more examples from other classrooms. We see some hands raised. Is that's not Sealy, that's Cook City. Is that Morin Elementary? And then, yeah.
Oh, Starling. Sealy. Sealy. Yeah. Well, Sealy's gonna type in.
I play the guitar.
Guitar.
I play the same.
You guys probably play together. I think there was a scene in the film where Castillo was saying, you know, you can play, you practice alone, but it's important to find a community of band members. And if you guys kind of remember, we talk about these terms for discussing cultural expression, you know, your community, whether that's music or whatever, that you find makes you feel comfortable when you're playing music, when you're in a cultural group. That's one way that music can kind of form that for you. And it sounds like you guys have some really supportive classmates that make that environment a fun one and maybe a safe one. And so those are some really great examples. Stevie, I'm wondering if you could give some examples or some inspiration for the students of how often do you play? Are you still on tour? What does your music life look like right now?
Well, for all you kids out there, I'm as old as dirt now. But when I was young, I used to come home from school every day in high school. I didn't start playing guitar till I was about 15, which was kind of late. But I'd come home every day and I'd play for about 3 hours a day. And I was obsessed with music. I loved it. I had a plan to join the Coast Guard when I got out of high school. Because like I said, I didn't have much college plans because no one ever told me about college prep classes. You know, my son gets to go to a private school and he learns about all these things. I didn't know about these things. And so I was just going to join the Coast Guard. But the music was working for me. And I told my father, I go, I'll give it a try. And then if it doesn't work, I'm going to join the Coast Guard. And for me, it worked. I just got lucky. You know, you have to work really hard. But I did it because I loved it, not because I was trying to become rich or any of those things. I just did it because I could not do it. So my advice to all the kids out there is you should always play music because it's a way of music makes your brain more creative in many aspects. You probably could be a better mathematician if you listen to really cool music. But I did it. I got lucky, but I did it because I loved it. And I would advise anybody that if they really love it to do it. And if they do it for the right reasons, not for fame and not for money. If you're lucky, you get some fame and you get some money. Me right now, I don't play as much as I used to. I never practice anymore, but I have my own guitars that are named after me, and I have my own, you know, guitar gear that's made by big companies that are named after me now. And I was just in Japan. I got home this morning. I have a gigantic tour. I have to go back in January, and I'm going to be there for 2 months, April into June. I believe like 60, 70,000 tickets sold. It's a big deal. It's kind of cool because, you know, I'm a native guy, and they all know that. And I play, and there's all these Japanese people that love the culture. You know, that's part of the reason I wanted to make Rumble was I was traveling around the world constantly since I was about 22 years old. And I realized that everywhere I went in the world, people worshiped Native Americans. They worshiped the culture. They worshiped the ideology, maybe how we think about the earth and how we think about life. And then I come home to America and I realized that most of my Native friends felt like nobody liked them at all. And I kept saying, man, these people love us. And that's why I wanted to make Rumble, because I wanted people to see that Steven Tyler, all these people that are Slash and Martin Scorsese, the big one of the biggest movie makers, and all these people worship our culture, and them saying it on camera was really important. That's why, you know, the film was important, because it wasn't a race film. I didn't have Native people saying we were better than this guy and that guy was, you know, it wasn't that. I just let the greatest people that we all. It's undisputable that Eric Clapton or Tony Bennett, these people are iconic artists, and for them to talk about how they worship these Native people, I thought it was really important for Native people to see that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm curious too, since we are talking about film, and to make a project this size, it's a big feat, and I'm sure this took you a while. And something we do here at the Institute when I go into classes and we talk about film and whatnot is that process. And I know you were the executive producer on this film, and I'm wondering, a lot of students might not know what that means or what's entailed in a project this size to get this message out there. Because I think what film does really well is it shines a light on something that is maybe not talked about and should be, and it starts a discussion around stories that matter. And so if you wouldn't mind, do you mind talking a little bit about what is entailed in putting together a film this size and sharing with the film students?
Well, you know, mostly now I'm writing, and I'm working in film and television a lot now, and I'm still learning about it, so I'm no expert. But Rumble was my first film, and I'm executive producer. Executive producer can mean a lot of things. Sometimes the executive producer is the person who puts up the money. Sometimes an executive producer you'll see on a film is maybe just somebody who's connected to somebody else. You know, it can be in film, an executive producer can be a lot of things. It could be a wishy-washy credit. It could be an important credit. In my place, I was the one who created I had the story. I had been working on it. I brought it to a film company in Canada. Now, since I wasn't Canadian, I couldn't be listed as just a regular producer, which I normally would have been. I would have been executive producer and a producer because I produced the film. but I couldn't be listed as that and still have the film be eligible for the Canadian funding that we needed to make the film. So there's a lot of politics involved in this stuff because it costs a lot of money to make films and television, and you have to figure out where it's from, and there's certain rules if the money's coming from government programs. But the real thing is if you got a great story to tell and you really flesh it out and you really get down to it, that's the most important part about filmmaking, is finding that story and getting that story told.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I always tell students, it's like you can have the fanciest equipment in the world, and if you don't have a good story and if you don't have a good subject, then it's going to be a crap film.
You know what else? Yeah, it's great that you say that, because you can have the crappiest equipment in the world and still make an amazing film because the story's so strong. It's really story first, the details, you know.
Well, I think that's a really lovely note to work on, and I'm sure, or to leave on. I'm sure there's a lot of students here that have thought about maybe writing or filmmaking as a career, and I think that this is a really great example of, you know, maybe you didn't do this all your life, but you found a subject you were interested in and diving in at full force. And so before we close up here, I'm curious, actually, Stevie, if you have any questions for the students that are joining us. We've got elementary, we've got middle school, we've got high school. If you want to ask a question to us before we go, I'm flipping the tables here.
You know, I don't have any questions asked, but I will say this. Originally, I made Rumble to be a small little film for PBS television for Native people. It was a film, it was like something I wanted to do for the indigenous people around the world. And it wasn't supposed to be a film that changed the world. It wasn't supposed to be any of these things. And what happened was the film came out, and next thing you know, I was in Australia, and I'm in Hungary, and I'm in England, I'm in France, I'm all over the planet. And in the film theater, the theaters are packed everywhere, and the film's winning awards, and Canadian Academy Awards, and we won Sundance and all these things. And it changed everything. But still, at the end of the day, I made the film to be a small film for Native people. So it took the Native community a lot longer to start seeing the film. I remember we were at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame showing Rumble, and a Native man came in. You just happened to be walking by. He was visiting Cleveland, and he saw it, and he goes, "Oh, what's that? I'll go see it." And he was in tears. He tried to ask me a question at the end of the film, and he was crying. And Native people are just now getting to see this film and really seeing it, and it's taken a couple of years. And I just wanted everyone to know that you can do something that can change people's lives, and you don't have to be a famous person, and you don't have to, you know, I didn't even know what I was doing. I told you I got a D in history class in high school, and I know it's funny, but it's true. But perhaps my teachers didn't understand me enough to teach me what I needed to know. And now I get the last laugh, perhaps. You know what I mean? How funny is this? So anybody out there, all you people out there are capable of doing anything that can change the world. And if I could do it, anybody could do it, because so I don't really have a question for you. I just want everyone to know out there that anything is possible. Anything is possible. And even if it looks unobtainable, I mean, I never thought I'd make a film that won Sundance. We never even thought we'd get in Sundance. So anything is possible. And that's the thing a message I want to leave with young people, that you can do anything. You'd be surprised what you could accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it is really a nice reminder. We have students joining us from really rural areas of Montana that maybe things seem a little less accessible, but we have technology like this that can bring us all together in one room, start these conversations that really matter. And we do want to hear from you, students. So if you could, since closing out here and saying our goodbyes, I would love if everybody could write down something that they learned from today's discussion, just to see if we're making it through to you guys, and a question you still have. I know we covered a lot of content. Maybe some of you haven't seen the film, but we would really love to hear from you. And I see one more hand, so we'll answer that question before we leave. I think it was, is that Ronan? If you want to ask one more question before we sign off here.
Ronan,
Hi. We were wondering what style of music are you playing on your tour? For Stevie.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
You guys can just Google. You guys can Google it. You want to talk about mixing culture? I have a friend in Japan. His name is Koshi Inaba, Inaba, and he is probably he's the biggest selling artist in Japanese history. He sold over 100 million records. He's a Japanese guy. The funny thing is he loves native culture. He once went on a tour of a Navajo reservation, and all the tourists got off the bus and tried to take photos with him because they thought he was Navajo when he's actually Japanese. And he and I were friends. We made a record we made a record for fun a few years ago called Inaba Solace. My last name's Solace, and it went gold. And we play these gigantic concerts. And that music's weird. It's like a mixture of dance and rock and roll, and there's no rules. We can do whatever we want. So, but I spent most of my life playing sort of more edgier rock and roll and funk music with George Clinton, Bootsy Collins, Mick Jagger, Justin Timberlake, Public Enemy, T.I. Any of you guys might have known the big hit song called Dead and Gone by T.I. and Justin Timberlake. I played guitar on that. I played guitar on a lot of stuff that people hear on the radio. So I'm a rock and roll guy deep down is what I am. I'm a surfer, skateboarder, rock and roll, Native American guy.
Okay, we just want to say thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And on that wonderful note, we have a little less surfing here in Montana, but skateboarding is really big in this state. So
Hey,
I'm sure
I
we
live
got
in
some
Austin,
skaters out there.
Texas. I live in Austin, Texas now, and I've missed the ocean so much.
Well, coming from a landlocked state, we don't get much of it here. And Mike, did you want to say anything before we sign off? Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time out of your day.
Sure, just glad to be part of the discussion, and I brought in my harp. I thought I'd close out with a little blues riff. You guys want to hear a little blues?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, here we go. How's that?
All right.
Thank you for sharing that. Wish I was more musical myself. On that final note, thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day. Thank you, classes across the state of Montana, Morin Elementary, Ronan, Drummond, Arley, Sealy, Cook City. There's more there that I didn't mention, but we couldn't do this without your participation, and thank you for your hard-hitting questions. Join us. I've got one last slide before I have you go. We do have a film festival coming up here in February. It is 10 days, and I run a program called Filmmakers in the Schools, where we bring filmmakers, world-class filmmakers from across the world into classrooms across Montana. So if you're not able to get into if I can't bring a filmmaker into your classroom, we do virtual screenings with Inspired Classroom here. So if you're interested in this, send me or Kathleen and Allie an email, and we can get you plugged in and signed up for this. This is a great opportunity to talk to hotshots like Stevie Salas and bring in Mike Jetty if you're able to join us. So without further ado, I'll let you guys go on with your day, but thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time, hopefully in February.
Hey, thank you guys for doing this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time.